just want to welcome everybody who's joining us right now for this month's Tree Talk. We're going to be starting shortly, and we appreciate you taking time to learn more about trees in Nashville. All right, we are just going to wait a couple of minutes while people are joining us and give everybody an opportunity to log in. Maybe you're having lunch. Hopefully somebody out there is having a glass of wine. I know it's a little early, but it seems totally appropriate. Yeah.
Wine and cheese.
Oh, excellent.
And trees.
But Jennifer, I'm excited to see how many people are joining us. This is great. Clearly we have a great topic, and I know for a fact we've got excellent guest speakers. So we're going to have some great information for everyone. But we're going to wait maybe one more minute before we start, just to let a few stragglers get in and to get another glass of wine before you start. I'm not drinking, just so everybody knows. And Jen, please don't record this because I'm kind of going off the rails here.
It's all about the trees.
I know. Well, it looks like we have kind of are flattening out there. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time today on Thursday to join us for our monthly Tree Talk. My name is Sharon Smith. I'm Assistant Director of Public Works, and I'm so proud to work with the Public Works tree expert, Jennifer Smith. Jennifer is responsible for all of the right-of-way tree activities here in Nashville, the Tree Advisory Committee, and is not only knowledgeable, but it does a great job at finding guest speakers to share a broad range of information on trees. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer, but before I do, if during the program you have questions, notice the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can type them in down there, and if we have time, they will either be answered live at the end, or if we run out of time, we may have to email the responses out to everyone. At this time, Jennifer, you're on.
Thank you, Sharon. So Tree Talk is presented by the Metro Tree Advisory Committee, which is a host of people that care about trees. And the advisory committee works to plant and preserve our urban forests, basically. And we started Tree Talk last year after the pandemic prevented us from getting out as we have in the past to the community. So we've talked on our tree inventory in Nashville, how to do utility pruning. We've gotten a lot of questions on why NES does pruning a certain way. We've got that answered. Native trees and the historic and landmark and championship tree program. And so those are archived at publicworkswebinars.nashville.gov. And this presentation will also be archived there within the week. I am so excited to get to talk about Weed Wrangle. It's a phenomenon that's going across the country, but I'm so proud of an old friend of mine, Cayce McAlister, who got this started in Nashville. She planted the seed, and she's going to tell you all about what Weed Wrangle is and how you can get involved. But it started in 2014, and now it's in 18 states, and it's scheduled to go nationwide. And it is making a difference. And I encourage everyone to sponsor a weed wrangle in your community, weed wrangle in your own yard, and go out and volunteer for one of the other wrangles that have been scheduled. I've re-wrangled every year at Warner Parks, and I have to say it is fun. At the end of the day, you can look back and say, wow, we're making a difference. So Cayce, through her garden club, which is the Garden Club of Nashville, started this. So Cayce, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Do my screen share here. All right. There we go. All right, as my sweet friend Jennifer said, my name is Cayce McAlister, and I'm a member of the Garden Club of Nashville, which is a member of the Garden Club of America. And as Jennifer said, I'm here to talk to you today about Weed Wrangle and what it is and how it started and why it matters and how you can join us as we wrangle our way across the country. But first, let me give you a little context. The Garden Club of Nashville was started in 1928 and became a member of the Garden Club of America in 1932. Part of the purpose of the Garden Club of America and the Garden Club of Nashville is to restore and improve and protect the quality of the environment through educational programs and actions in the field of conservation and civic improvement. The Garden Club of America has been involved in legislative activities since its earliest days, starting in 1921 when our members testified before Congress on behalf of the parks of Washington, D.C. In the 1930s, we were there to battle to save the redwoods in California. In 1970s, as really the environmental movement really grew, GCA's legislative involvement grew right along with it. Today, we have 10 position papers that you'll see listed. Of note is the Native Plants Position Paper, which supports any legislation that supports public land planting policies that use native plants, control invasive plants, and preserve and restore healthy ecosystems. We have MOUs, Memorandums of Understanding, with 9 organizations, including the National Audubon Society, the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Royal Horticultural Society. With 200 clubs across the country and 18,000 members, we put our money where our mouth is by offering 28 merit-based scholarships. This year, we awarded over $306,000 to 64 scholars. And it's possible that some of you in the audience today are past GCA scholars. So let me get on to the subject. We're volunteers, and this is what we do. We had a Boy Scout troop at Warner Park that did this time release video for us that I think is just entertaining.
Wow, look at how much they're getting out.
No, isn't it something?
I mean, you get a good exercise doing this.
So Weed Wrangle is a collaborative network. It's an example of action. We use the knowledge of botanists and other horticultural experts to educate our volunteers as to the benefit of the eradication of the invasive plant and the benefit of replanting with natives. This knowledge is therefore implemented not only on the public land, but we hope our volunteers will take that new knowledge and enthusiasm to their own homes and continue their efforts there. This all started with us because the Garden Club of America has a national initiative called Partners for Plants that was launched in 1992. It's a joint habitat restoration program of the Conservation and Horticulture Committees. Its purpose is to facilitate projects between local Garden Club of America clubs, which Nashville is one, and land managers on federal, state, and local public parks. Since this project was launched by the Garden Club of America, over 500 other projects have launched across the country. One especially successful model is Weed Wrangle. So let me take you back to the very beginning. In 2014, I was the new president of the Garden Club of Nashville when I got a call from a Garden Club of America member from Portland, Oregon, who was then the Partners for Plants vice chairman, saying that she and her husband were coming to Nashville on a business trip and they wanted to see our project. Well, we already had a project at the Warner Parks going, so we popped them in the car and said, come on, let's go see what's at Warner Parks. Well, we got there and they said, what's that stuff? They didn't know Japanese honeysuckle and privet because our invasives in this part of the country are different than their invasives in Oregon. And they were shocked to see how much of it we had. And they also had no idea how really destructive it could be. So they said, okay, Cayce, so if you can get this stuff out of the park, bravo, but it's still across the street in the neighbor's yard. So as a little aside, I was in a big box store in Texas and I saw the big box selling Japanese honeysuckle, which to me is the perfect metaphor of the big box being the invasive, forcing the native to go out of business. So think about that for a minute. Well, I digress. Back to the Weed Wrangle story. So the Garden Club of Nashville had this idea of some sort of citywide partnership that would involve identification, education, and eradication of invasive plants. This concept was massaged through a series of conversations with Paul Fowler from the Friends of Warner Parks, who was already our partner, and the Garden Club of Nashville members. But our secret weapon is native Nashvilleian Steve Manning. Steve, who with Lee Patrick are owners of a company called Invasive Plant Control that just happens to be based right here in Nashville. Invasive Plant Control's travel teams roam the U.S. targeting invasive species in all the fragile natural areas. Steve and Lee had the knowledge and the expertise to help us launch this idea, and they've been instrumental in the development of Weed Wrangle. Since we are not the experts, Steve said to us in one of our meetings, the Garden Club of America, with its leadership abilities, have engaged target audience that professionals have not been able to educate. And when he said that, I really didn't know what he meant. But he meant that we were a different voice with the same message. So the idea for Weed Wrangle was born that October day of 2014. My cute sister-in-law thought of the name Weed Wrangle, and a friend of my daughter's drew the logo, and the Garden Club of Nashville trademarked the name. It was our first collaborative effort. As an aside, the reason we trademarked the name was because that's about the same time marijuana was starting to be sold, and we didn't want the marijuana people to get the name. So that's why we did that. Steve went on to say, collaboration through community partnerships is the answer to the eradication of invasives and the renewal of natives. We quickly realized that partnerships and collaboration were the only answer. We also knew that education had to be a factor in eradication. So in a nutshell, this is what we did. We learned from Paul Fowler that invasive weed pulls were already happening in many of our city parks. So we scheduled a meeting with all the volunteer coordinators from public parks and green spaces in Nashville to pitch the idea of a one-day collaborative effort under the umbrella of Weed Wrangle. Really the same thing everybody had already been doing on their own, but now hosting eradication events same day, citywide with a media blitz. Partnerships were formed and teamwork developed. Every organization had something to offer, including plenty of invasives. Some of our partners are propagating their own native plants and trees, and others are applying for grants and soliciting donations. At every stage of the event, we work to educate. We always are conscious of delivering a clear message to our partner agencies, our media outlets, and the public. We provided citywide publicity, which we think is important about spreading the word, not just about the event, but about the problem. We think that community education is an important component of success. Some years we hosted community meetings in partnership with local universities. We've also hosted a couple of Weeds in the Woods hikes at Radnor Lake, led by a university professor. And at every site, we've handed out educational literature. Now, the older I get, the more I realize that we all think differently, but we all have something to offer. For example, I'm actually a social worker by profession, and social psychology is my subject. And I believe that Weed Wrangle is an example of social psychology put into practice. Specifically, these two words, collaboration and network. Collaboration is the name of the game. When people work together toward a common goal, they feel a sense of belonging to a greater community, which improves their motivation, their health, and their happiness. Collaboration is a really simple word for a very big concept. Teamwork and relationships develop while being part of a group and working together toward a common goal. Networks are the building block of social capital. They bring people together with a common sense of purpose. Therefore, Weed Wrangle is a collaborative network. Everybody likes being part of a team with team goals and working together on projects. It gives our community members ownership of a project and true interest in public land. because truly, if you work that land, you own that land. We love our volunteers, and we're not proud. We will recruit any old you. Now, Jennifer asked me to speak a little today about some of the non-native invasive plants that are particularly prevalent in the Nashville area. Since I'm not a botanic expert, I got a little help from my friends. For starters, bush honeysuckle. Bush honeysuckle was introduced to the United States in 1855. Bush honeysuckle was promoted by state and federal agencies to improve wildlife habitat and also as a very popular ornamental. Then there's Japanese honeysuckle, which was also introduced as an ornamental plant in 1806. In the early 1900s, the railroads planted it along the embankments to control soil erosion. Another one is privet. Privet was introduced into the United States in 1852 as another ornamental, aggressive and troublesome privet. It forms dense thickets, particularly in bottomland woods and along fence rows, thus gaining access to forests, fields, and right-of-ways. Another interesting one is Japanese stillgrass. It's an annual grass native to China and India. It was introduced to America in 1919 and thought to be originally introduced in Tennessee to be used as a packing material for porcelain. English ivy was introduced by European colonists as early as 1727. I also think of Euonymus when I speak about English ivy because they're very similar. Although recognized as a serious weed, it continues to be sold and marketed as an ornamental plant in the United States. As you all know, as tree people, an infested tree will exhibit decline for many years before it dies. The added weight of these vines also make the tree susceptible to bacterial leaf scorch, a harmful plant pathogen that affects a wide variety of native and ornamental trees such as elms, oaks, and maples. Euonymus in trees, and I don't know if this is ivy or Euonymus on this slide because I can't see it well enough, but that is my personal pet peeve. Euonymus just drives me nuts in trees.
Me too.
English ivy and Euonymus are aggressive invaders that threaten all vegetation levels of forested and open lands, along the ground as well, and into the forest canopy. Vines attached to brickwork and the bark of trees and other surfaces by numerous root-like structures. So when you grow ivy on your house, you're making a big mistake. Non-native invasive plants grow and reproduce rapidly, causing major changes to the area where they become established. They compete for sun, water, and soil. When the non-native invasive plants choke out our native biological plants, diversity is reduced and our native species fail to thrive. So here's a list of the worst offenders in Tennessee. It's called the Established Threats List, and I refer you to the Tennessee Invasive Plant Council for more information about any of these. But think about it. Look at this list. How many of these do you see every day? What's going to happen to our natural system when these take over? Non-native invasive plants disrupt the natural system, which affects native plants and animals alike. Did you know that 1/3 of public parks and green spaces are made up of invasive plants? 1/3.
Wow.
96% less food is available in those areas that are invaded. Insects pollinate 87.5% of plants and 90% of flowering plants. So insects need plants. If you have no insects, you have no birds. If you have no birds and no bees, you have no pollinators. And if you have no pollinators, you have no food. Do you see a little pattern forming here? It's the plant community that defines the animal population in a natural system. So a threat to native plants is a threat to native wildlife. Invasives have a negative effect on our economy, our environment, and human health. So why are we not making this a priority? So where's Weed Wrangle today? In our first Weed Wrangle Nashville in 2015, we partnered with 10 public parks and green spaces across Nashville. We had 500 volunteers and over 1,300 man hours. Needless to say, we were shocked by the success. By 2017, the number of partners in Nashville had doubled. Weed Wrangle had also spread to all the Garden Club of America clubs in Tennessee. We also that year gratefully partnered with the Tennessee State Parks, and we're really proud of that partnership. That year, we ended up with the four major cities in 34 parks and one national park with over 3,000 participants statewide. Joining in the fun that year was also New Orleans, Louisiana, with City Park there, Greenville, Jackson, and Laurel, Mississippi, Dallas and Houston, Texas, and Grants Pass, Oregon. Now we're in our 7th year, and we've added many states, and we have more in the wings. Weed Wrangle started out as a little project in Nashville, Tennessee that became invasive in 100 other cities across 17 states. But we've had some interesting things happen along the way that we really didn't expect. We didn't expect so much excitement about our new and different voice, as Steve Manning said we had. So this really just started out as a simple idea that went from us calling our friends across the state in the other garden clubs and asking them to participate to now people are calling us. For example, Florida and Indiana both wanted to hold statewide events. Of course, we said yes, but it caused us to stop and think, how are we going to go about this? Because this has all been a learning process for us because we're really community organizers, not industry professionals. Now, as an aside, 3 years later, Indiana has created an Indiana Invasives Initiative with a 10-year strategic plan that includes Weed Wrangle events. They've actually hosted well over 100 Weed Wrangle events, and everywhere you see a red dot on that map on the right-hand side, the Indiana map, those are Weed Wrangle events that have been hosted. We had planned on having 6 events in New York this past spring, and thanks to COVID, we know how that went. But we are meeting with them now just about monthly to try to work on this statewide event on May 1st. Now, I don't know how if that's gonna happen or not because of COVID, but we'll see. We are planning. We also have a new partnership with the national parks for the 20th anniversary of the invasive species management teams. There are 17 teams that serve 290 national parks. Now, right now across the national parks, they're not having any volunteer events, but we're making plans to get those events lined out and ready when they do open up post-COVID. Our newest partnership is with Doug Tallamy and his Homegrown National Park Initiative. Doug coined the phrase Homegrown National Park for the purpose of catalyzing a collective effort of individual homeowners, property owners, land managers, farmers, and anyone with soil to start a new habitat by first removing invasive plants and then replanting with natives. This is the largest cooperative conservation project ever conceived or attempted. It is a collective of small efforts by many people. Doug says that if we confine all of our conservation efforts into patches of protected areas, we'll never get ahead. We need to practice conservation where we live, where we work, and where we farm, because we humans now occupy or have seriously altered nearly all of the spaces outside of parks and preserves. Now stay with me here. Last spring, when COVID stopped our events, we initiated the nationwide stay-at-home Weed Wrangle, asking people to concentrate on removing just one invasive in their own space. This spring, We anticipate that Weed Wrangle events will be reduced because of COVID restrictions. So we have a plan to have another nationwide call to action with a stay-at-home Weed Wrangle in partnership with Doug Tallamy and the Homegrown National Park. We are going to ask participants to concentrate on removing just one invasive in their space, but this time to map their event on the Homegrown National Park website. Now, if you look at this map, it's interesting because it's not going to pinpoint your exact yard. There's no privacy concerns. It's really more going to pinpoint a county and a state. So I pulled up here the Tennessee map, and you'll see that there's just 5 plantings so far in Davidson County because this map just launched in the last few weeks. But you can also see the whole state of Tennessee. So when you personally map your space, you can also go to a link there that says planting goals and add your planting goals for your particular property. So it's going to be a really good way to map what individuals are doing across the country. But I've actually spoken with them and they would like public spaces to be listed too. So now everybody has something to do. If you were bored, you now have something to do. Get on the map. Another Nashville connection is Margaret Wrinkle, who writes for the New York Times. Margaret did a story on Weed Wrangle that was a real game changer. The title of her story was "The Real Aliens in Our Backyard. The future of this country may depend on changing the way suburban Americans think about plants," which is exactly what we're trying to do. Educate the public to think differently. Now, I've got to say, as a layperson in the world of invasives, I remember from my childhood looking out the back door of our house or looking into the woods, and I can see every tree trunk. Now I can't see any of them. So I will tell you that weeds have ruined my eyeballs forever. Honestly, it's all I see. So if education worked on me, it'll work on the general public too. So with my newfound knowledge, I have a personal responsibility of my own and a shared responsibility with my community to use this newfound knowledge for action. Weed Wrangle uses the knowledge of botanists and other horticultural experts to educate volunteers about plant conservation and restoration. Our volunteers go to a public property, they give of their time, and in return, we give them the knowledge to take back to their own homes and continue their efforts there. I want to say that the Garden Club of Nashville is so grateful to all of our Nashville partners that have believed in this concept and have grown right along with us for the last 7 years. Without your support, people like Jennifer Smith and Patricia Miller, we couldn't have done it without you all. This is very much a homegrown grassroots effort that we have taken this concept to the rest of the world. And I want to say how much your friendship and support has meant to all of us. And you should be Nashville proud. Thank you all so much for letting me speak to you today and talk to you about Weed Wrangle. And if you're not already hosting an event, reach out to us and join us because together we can make a difference.
Thank you,
Thank
Cayce.
you,
That was
Jennifer.
so informative. One of the things, being the tree lady here, that I have talked to Cayce about, and she's let me have a platform within Weed Wrangle, is what Weed Wrangle does is open up sunlight in the forest by getting rid of the invasives. And so who's ever back first gets the sunlight. And so we're really encouraging seedling plantings, tree plantings in those spaces so that the invasives don't come back. And I think that's a good philosophy. I know that Warner Parks has been doing that for a very long time. And also I want to mention here at Public Works, we have a tool share program where many groups who do weed wrangles will check out our mattocks and our shovels, and we're getting new weed wrenches in that will be helpful as well. So that's through Metro Public Works. I think we had one question here about how, if they had privet, the birds, spread it through through the berries, and it's just wrenching the roots out of the ground, which is what we do during weed wrangle. And in your private yard, if you want to add a chemical on it, like Roundup or something, that will really help do the job for you. The birds are everywhere, the privets everywhere. So literally getting rid of the source, the resource of the plant is the way to go. And that's what Weed Wrangle is all about. Okay. Thank you, Cayce. I hope everyone volunteers for a Weed Wrangle. And again, it's a great workout. It's a lot of fun, but some years I'm doing the wrenching and pulling the roots out. And some years I'm just literally moving what's been already cut out to the streets. And so it's all levels of can-do that participate. Next, another favorite subject of mine is on tree physiology. And I think understanding how trees live can help you diagnose just about any plant issue, tree issue you have, because they have to be able to take care of themselves. And so Dr. David Mercker with the UT Extension Service has done a program that we're going to see, his program, and it's part of his Porch Forestry series he's done. And so he's going to talk about why do trees die. If you understand that, then you understand how they live. And that's the whole point of this. And again, this is one of my favorite all-time subjects. It really, you're going to be much more in tune to trees, and they are so fascinating. So we have a video that we're going to show. Again, it's backyard forestry.
Back Porch Forestry. Today's session is on tree physiology. Specifically, I was asked the question a number of years ago and had a little difficulty answering this, but somebody asked, why do trees die? Why do trees die? And to understand how or why trees die, we must first understand the process by which they live. And so we're going to have an introduction of tree physiology, the process by which trees live. So I want to begin with just some general concepts of tree parts. If we begin at the very top, you see the word terminal. That's the leading branch of a tree, the tip top, if you will. Coming down the right side, you'll see some words scrambled together that say live crown length. I like to think of that instead as live crown ratio, but it's that portion of total tree height that has living branches on it. So a healthier tree generally will have a higher live crown ratio. Coming down below the surface then, below the soil level, you'll see three different types of roots. There's a tap root that anchors the tree. Lateral roots extend outward, and from these lateral roots spring forward root fans. Root fans are very important because those tiny root fans or hair-like roots are the ones that procure the moisture and the nutrients and the oxygen to help the tree function. And so and coming around on the far side, you'll see the trunk or the bole, sometimes called the stem of the tree. This is very important to foresters and to the forest industry because this is where we get our wood products from, this section right here. And then we have the lateral branches as well. So a few things to consider. Trees expand really in three different directions, three different areas, three different points of expansion. And the first is root tips. And so although we can't see it, roots are expanding outward and downward on a regular basis. But the tree also grows on the tip of its crown as well. And so that would be the terminal bud and the axillary bud or lateral bud. And these are constantly going out and trying to find new sources of sunlight to help the tree grow. And then finally, the tree, of course, expands in girth too. The cambium expands each year. And so let me show you what I mean by that. You see the word cambium. Cambium is located beneath the bark. And each year through mitosis, it produces two different types of cells. It produces xylem, which is new wood. And the function of the xylem is to carry water and nutrients up to the rest of the tree so that these processes can function. That's the xylem. We think of xylem because it's going up. We say xy high. Cambium also produces phloem. Phloem is new bark. And the function of phloem is to carry the nutrient, the sugar that's produced in the crown of the tree down to the rest of the tree. So we remember that as flow low, xy high and flow low. Well, as xylem ages, it becomes old wood or heartwood. And as phloem ages, it becomes bark. So keep that in mind as we progress. Here's a picture that I borrowed from Alex Shigo. This tree was wounded. You can see the wound on it. Something to realize that trees never really heal when they're wounded. What trees do is they hide their problems. They hide their wounds. And so you can see where the wound occurred. And then by year 1, it was beginning to grow over. Year 2, you see these annual growth rings. Year 3, year 4, by year 5, that wound finally seals off, but it will always be with the tree. And by year 6, the wound is just a bump on a log. So to understand how trees die, we must first understand the process by which they grow. And so we examine the branch of science that explains the function of living organisms and their parts. And that's known, of course, as physiology. So the major physiological processes in a tree include the following, and they all have 4 or 5 syllables, but bear with me. Photosynthesis, respiration, transpiration, and translocation. And very simply, we're going to address each of these 4 processes today so that you can understand how trees grow a little more clearly. And we begin with photosynthesis. We all remember what photosynthesis is. You learned that in grade school or high school biology. It's simply the conversion of the sun's energy. The plant, in this case the tree, converts the sun energy into food. That food is sugar, and more specifically, it's the carbohydrate molecule. And even more specifically, it looks like this, C6H12O6. Now, a point I want to make is that people oftentimes will tell me that they have fed their tree. They went out and fed their tree. What they mean to say is that they fertilized their tree. We can't feed a tree. A tree feeds itself. It produces its own energy. But the things that we do to or around the tree can help it produce food, or in many cases be a detriment to that process. So photosynthesis produces this sugar, this carbohydrate molecule. Now, the window of opportunity I'm talking about for hardwood trees, these are the deciduous trees. The window of opportunity for those trees to produce carbohydrates is really very short. It must be done in only about 5 months out of the year, and even during that time, only about 6 or 8 hours a day, because no photosynthesis occurs at night. There's no sunlight, so it can't photosynthesize. And when it gets really, really hot outside, photosynthesis shuts down because the loss of water is so great that the tree can't afford to lose any more water in this process, so it shuts down. So 6 to 8 hours a day, only about 5 months out of the year, it better be very, very, very good at creating food, because it has to do it in 1,000 hours out of a year when there are 8,700 plus hours in a year to do it. So the daily carbohydrate production, this is just a relative graph that kind of gives you a general idea of the point I'm trying to make. The rate of photosynthesis increases to a point as temperature increases. So the spring of the year, boy, it kicks in early summer, but then as temperatures get too high, whether it be during an entire month or during just certain times of the day, this photosynthesis rate crashes and affects the amount of food that a tree can produce. Looked at another way, seasonally, this is the carbohydrate production. It occurs, generally speaking, this time of the year, with nothing occurring in the winter months. So again, carbohydrate produced in the summer must carry the tree for the entire 12 months. Because even in the wintertime, the tree is using up this stored sugar. So here's a seasonal pattern. What we've got here are the 5 seasons of the year. Let that sink in a second. The 5 seasons of the year. And the darker the tree, the more sugar it has, more sugar it has stored. And so we would expect season number 4 is late summer. So at the end of the growing season, you would expect the tree to be pretty plush with energy. A lot of sugar stored up, because during the wintertime, it has to then use that energy. And during the wintertime, what happens is these carbohydrates are pulled down and stored in the roots, in the trunk, and in the buds as well. And just the tree more or less just kind of survives through the winter. Then in early spring, what happens is if you look at number 1 there, the carbohydrates now are being pulled upward to the branches. Why? To prepare for leaf emergence. It takes a lot of energy to flush leaves and to refoliate itself. And so you would expect that, but you would also expect that by the time spring is in full force, after leaf emergence has occurred, the carbs have been depleted. So it's used up its energy, and the tree isn't yet perhaps photosynthesizing, at least not to the rate that it could, because it's still kind of cool. So the last thing we want then during spring, particularly if you have an early spring, is you don't want a late frost that kills the leaves. Every 10, 20 years or so, you'll see something widespread like that around the region, and the trees will defoliate. And so then they have to call upon depleted energy reserves to try to flush again using dormant buds that they hold in storage. And so it can be a critical time for a tree if something bad happens. And then by midsummer, the tree is replenishing its depleted carbohydrates. So that's kind of how it works. Might help you understand this process a little bit better. So if photosynthesis is the process that produces the carbohydrate, then respiration is the process that breaks it back down. So they produce their own food, but that means they also use their own food as well. And so respiration then is the oxidation or the using up of carbohydrates. Why? To provide energy to keep those cells alive, to fuel tree growth, respiration. And so respiration, if you were to look at it in a chemical equation, is nothing more than photosynthesis in reverse order. It builds the molecule up, then it breaks the molecule back down. Photosynthesis, respiration. I kind of like to think of respiration, periodically I'll personify a tree, give them human characteristics. Think of respiration kind of equivalent to our digestion of food. So photosynthesis is seasonal. We've already established that. It occurs roughly over about 1,000 hours per year, but respiration occurs all year long. So as you might expect, the rate of photosynthesis must exceed the rate of respiration, because without a surplus of carbohydrates, what's going to happen is there's going to be a deficit of energy. And then the tree vigor is going to decline, and eventually tree mortality will occur. No different than us. We can't starve ourselves. Trees can't be starved of energy either.
But they will come in maybe soon. Yeah.
We must minimize all the activities that could hinder carbohydrate production. So I'm generally referring to yard tree maintenance and so forth. We must minimize all activities that could hinder carbohydrate production. And what are those things? What are the things that we should avoid around trees? Well, we don't want to remove healthy photosynthesizing limbs, particularly during the growing season. That's what most people do, though. They can't mow underneath their tree anymore, so they start hacking limbs off, in the spring or summer. And that's exactly what you don't want to do. Pruning should occur in late winter. I like to think January, February, maybe through about early March is all. That's when we want to prune our trees. We also don't want to damage the cambium of a tree, because we know that water has to come up through that area. Energy has to come down through that area. And so we want to avoid weed eater damage or damage from equipment or mowers or things like that. Soil compaction falls into that. We've mentioned those fine roots already. But compacted soil will hinder that fine root development. Tiny roots can't penetrate soil that's heavy to clay or just has been compacted with equipment. So if you're building, try to avoid driving underneath trees and around trees. Put a barrier around them so that the equipment will come in and miss that area. And then finally, we don't want to damage the root system either. Oftentimes people will bury a water line or a cable or something like that, not thinking that they might be harming the tree, but you can harm the tree in a great sense if you do that. So let's look at a profile of the roots. What we've got is a top view and a side view. And it's the same view of the same stump essentially, but I want you specifically to look at these root fans. So these right here, those tiny roots right there, but if you look at it from the side profile, you'll see how they are emerging and they grow toward the surface. And the reason is because that's where the water and the nutrients often are, and even the oxygen that roots might need for respiration. That's where that can be found. And so what we typically do in yard settings is we come in and throw a little mulch around the base of a tree. And again, I'm personifying a tree, but I think the tree looks down at that and says, what good did that do, really? If the root fans are clear out here, all we've done is maybe protected the tree from weed eater blight, but we really haven't helped the environment for the roots. So I guess what I'm saying is that in yard settings, if we're going to mulch, let's mulch. Let's do some good. Now that might look a little bit ridiculous, but consider this: how much of the forest is mulched? It's all mulched. And so if you think about it, fallen leaves and branches and so forth are all over the forest floor. So forests like that. Mulch is a good thing. It conserves moisture. It also softens up that soil, allows the roots to penetrate the soil a little bit better. And so start a trend in your neighborhood and begin mulching a little bit wider. You might be saying, well, who would do that? Well, I actually did that in a house that we lived in probably 15 years ago. These trees were already planted, and I could see they had Bermuda grass planted right up to the edge of the tree. And I knew that in the long run, the tree wouldn't like that. And so I deadened the grass, created a ring, and then came in and mulched the area and planted some desirable things up underneath it, pink dogwoods and hostas and so forth. And every year or two then I would come back and actually expand it by a foot or foot and a half. And the trees loved it. You can see how big they are here. And that was just about 3 years worth of growth between those two pictures. Trees like mulch. So let's look at the third physiological process, and that's transpiration, which is the process of water passing from the tree back into the atmosphere. And this occurs mostly through the stomas in the leaves, pores in the leaves. And so small pores exist in the leaves. They are called stomas, and they open and they close and regulate gas exchange and water movement, and thus tree growth. And so here's an example of a stoma that's open. So when photosynthesis is in full force and the tree is really generating or creating a lot of sugar, you would expect the stoma to be open and water is being released through this open stoma. But when the temperature gets hot or at nighttime, the stoma will close to prevent the loss of water as an effort to try to conserve the water for another time. So the mechanism of water movement in a tree, essentially it moves from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So as leaf cells dry then, they pull additional water from below. And transpiration rate then depends on the following. So you would expect low humidity, high winds, and high temperature to increase the rate. And so a tree might close the stomas if it senses low humidity or high wind or high temperature. And it might prefer to carry out its photosynthesis in mid-morning or later in the day after things have begun to cool down and maybe the winds died down. So carbohydrates are produced in the leaves. We understand that. And then they are transported to the stem and to the trunks and to the roots via the phloem cells for use. So that seems to be pretty clear. But you might not fully understand is the process of translocation. How do they get there? How do they get about? And that's translocation. So that's the piping system that distributes the food around in the tree. And through translocation then, this sugar, this carbohydrates, it supports 5 different processes in a priority order. So let's spend some time on this. In other words, what I'm trying to say is the sugar has been produced. Now what gets it first? So you might expect that the maintenance of living tissue is most important. In other words, the tree has to keep its living cells alive before it can do anything else. We're the same way as humans, right? And so that's that respiration we're talking about. It feeds the living cells through respiration. Now, if there's any sugar left over, any carbohydrates left over, the tree then directs it to the production of fine roots. That's those root fans, those tiny roots we were talking about. Those are very important because, like I said, their job is to procure moisture and nutrients and essentially so that the rest of the tree can survive and thrive. Now, if there's any sugar left over after all that, the tree sends it into flower and seed production. So as you can probably imagine, it takes a lot of energy to create a flower. And likewise, it takes a lot of energy for the fruit, whatever that fruit might be, an acorn, a hickory nut, for that matter, a coconut. It takes a lot of energy to produce that food. And if you ask most self-respecting deer and turkey why they eat acorns, because that's where the food is. And so a lot of energy goes into that. That's third in line. Now, if there's any sugar left over after that, it goes into what we call primary growth. And this is the elongation of the branches and the roots. So essentially what the tree is saying is, okay, I've taken care of number 1, number 2, number 3. Life's pretty good. I can now afford to go out and find a new piece of sky or find a new piece of earth down here. So they expand outward. That's what makes the crown of the tree wider and the branch and the roots longer and so forth. And so think of it this way. If those rare times when you might have got a raise and you're trying to decide, what are we going to do with this money now? And that's kind of where a tree is at this point. Everything's taken care of. It's gotten a raise. It has extra energy. What can we do with it? And so it goes to primary growth. Now, if there's any sugar left over after all that, it finally gets down to what I, as a forester, am interested in, and that's secondary growth. So that's growth in diameter. So think of that as growth in the girth of the trunk, in diameter of the trunk, the wood, in other words. And so what most people see is the growth ring. We talk about the annual growth ring, and you've counted the rings on a stump to determine how old the tree is. Maybe you've noticed some of the rings are closer together and some are farther apart. As a forester, I don't think of those as growth rings. I think of that as interest rate. And so we've got an asset, and then each year we're putting on additional growth onto that asset. And so only after all these processes have been satisfied does energy finally reach the trunk of the tree to expand in diameter. So in other words, if we're trying to grow wood fast, trees fast for a growing society, we need to make sure that these first 4 are already in line and take place. Because in a healthy tree, each of these processes is sufficiently fueled. Again, life is plush if all 5 of them are receiving the energy. But gradual mortality of a tree can be observed by examining these 5 processes in reverse order. In other words, a carbohydrate recall. So in other words, as a forester, I might come out and bore into the tree, and if I begin to see the growth ring shrinking, that's telling me the tree is in decline. And then you look at the end of the branches and you see, oh, it's not expanding in length anymore. And so pretty soon that means that the flower and fruit production is going to start declining. And unless we do something, the trees probably will eventually die. So think of it this way, kind of what I'm referring to as the carbohydrate balance. Photosynthesis produces the carbohydrate, respiration uses it up. And so you hope that the amount of carbohydrates produced in photosynthesis will exceed the rate that's being used up in respiration. That means life is pretty plush for the tree. But when this begins to balance out, say midlife in the tree, or because the tree has experienced maybe some increased competition from an adjacent tree, this balance equals until such time that it inverts. And the amount of sugar that's being used up through respiration exceeds photosynthesis. That can't continue, and eventually the tree will starve and die. And this is very common with really old trees, that there's just no hope. There's a point where you can't turn those trees around, not without perhaps spending a lot of money, and even then it oftentimes won't work. But tree mortality, I've sort of described this as a gradual energy losing process. Of course, it doesn't always happen that way. Mortality can also occur rapidly through some type of mechanical disruption. And so I've got some examples here. You see this upper picture is actually a situation where we intentionally killed the tree. We have severed the cambium. And you might say, why would you want to do that? Well, in a yard setting, you probably wouldn't want to do that, but in a forest setting, you might. And so the forest overproduces trees in many cases, more than what we need. And so trees compete with each other for all the elements, and they'll do it on their own, compete on their own, and some will win and some will lose, some will die. But maybe the ones that survive aren't the ones that you want to survive. And so foresters actually come in and deaden trees that are impacting the growth of the more desirable ones. So an example might be if we're trying to grow good quality oak, but that oak tree is being outcompeted by perhaps a hollow tree or a much lower value tree, we might kill that lower value tree in order for that growth to be shifted over to the desirable tree. So that can happen pretty quickly. Also, trees can die very rapidly if there's root damage. Entrenching, things like this can kill a tree pretty rapidly. And then also just storm damage. When a tree loses limbs, particularly larger trees, and they lose limbs during the growing season, they can die pretty quickly. So it's a process that can be slow or fast, tree mortality. So we kind of get back to or down to what the original question was: why do trees die? And really, they die because respiration stops. And respiration stops because carbohydrate production stops. And carbohydrate production stops because photosynthesis stops. And photosynthesis stops because of any number of factors can cause a tree to stop photosynthesizing. These are the variables that go into photosynthesis, and that's sunlight, water, nutrients, temperature, carbon dioxide, and oxygen. And these are the things, if any one of these are taken away from the equation, the tree will die. But as you look at that, it's probably not likely that CO2 or O2 are going to be a limiting factor. Rarely are nutrients truly limiting, and temperature normally is not a concern unless it's like a tree that was taken out of its natural environment and moved to a climate that it's not used to. Really what it boils down to is sunlight and water. Sunlight normally is not limiting either unless the tree maybe was planted when it was young and it became overtopped by another tree, or a building was constructed and it took away the sunlight. More often than not, it's going to be the water. That's what ends up killing trees in yard settings, is the lack of water. So here are the top 7 reasons why I see trees dying, particularly in yard settings. I'm just calling them collectively a disturbance. So a drought certainly will kill trees. They might grow well for a while, and then you'll have a severe drought. Soil compaction, we've stressed that already. Roots can't penetrate compacted soil. A lot of our housing subdivisions were built on areas that were once row crop fields, and maybe the soil's compacted. Just poor species selection. In other words, you've gone to a nursery and you've picked up a tree because you thought it would be good on your property, when in fact it's not suitable for that type of soil. And I think of trees that perform better in areas where it's typically wet, and we plant them on our dry sites and they do well for a while until they don't. So I encourage you to work with a professional to select trees, help you through that process. Of course, we know that storms and winds take out trees. Insects, particularly wood-boring insects, ones that bore in and feed on that sugar-rich cambium area, they cut off the flow of water and can kill a tree pretty quickly. Herbicides certainly can kill trees, although they're probably blamed for it too often. Most of the licensed applicators in yard settings, they know what they're doing. They have license, and so it's pretty rare, but it can happen. And then just competition from other trees, kill trees. I think of an example in a forest setting. Red cedar comes back very rapidly into old fields and areas that were abandoned, but in time, because they're not tolerant to shade, other trees grow up around them and they die out through competition. So that's kind of the summary of that. And so what I'm going to do is give you a moment to write down what you see on this slide here. Here's the URL for the survey. That certainly will assist me in future programs, and I would appreciate if you could take the time to fill that out. And then a more detailed publication actually exists on this that I developed about 15 years ago, Why Do Trees Die? And it's a long...
Thank you for that. So David Mercker, you can Google him and go to his website and see a lot of different programs that he does on back porch forestry. And he also has a publication on tree physiology you can look up. I have 1 more minute of time. I just want to thank our speakers, Cayce and David, and to note that our next tree talk will be in February the 16th at noon. And Neil Letson, who actually was our past president of the Metro Tree Advisory Committee, he is the president now of a statewide tree organization, the Tennessee Urban Forestry Council. And he's going to be talking about their programs, which are quite extensive, and he'll cover their Arboretum certification program. And then also we'll be discussing winter tree ID. So without the leaves there, how do you know which tree is which? You look for signs and clues in the bark and the stems. So again, register for February 16th, our next tree talk. And thank you so much for your interest in trees, and plant trees, water them, and count them in our Root Nashville tree canopy campaign. You can go to their website, and we want everyone to map their trees that they're planting, because our goal is to plant 500,000 trees by 2050, and that's going to involve everyone. So thanks again, Cayce and David, and see you in February.